Okay. Good morning. Okay, I don't think I can do a Texas accent. In fact, I'm not sure I can do any kind of accent. Okay, you have sat in this room for the last 3 days and you have heard speaker after speaker talk about all the things we need to do, but I think there's been a consistent message that one of the biggest obstacles to getting things done, to building the type of places we love, is how we build streets, is how we think about transportation. And so, this is the start of that discussion. This is getting down to the nitty-gritty of how we start changing the institutions that stand in the way of building great places. The transportation, the institutionalized transportation system that we have in place. Today, we have a visitor from Bristol, England, who is one of the most important figures for the last, I would say, half century in transportation. He has done work in pushing forward what seemed to a lot of us, maybe even just 10 years ago, to be a radical, if not crazy idea. 9 years ago in Pasadena, Ben Hamilton-Baillie came and gave a talk. It was given in a tiny room to a few people that might have heard the term and were curious. Now he comes back to the US. I haven't developed and pushed this idea forward to such an extent that it's now considered by many in the UK to be one of the most important things that is happening. So what we're going to do today is to get you to get some sense of what shared space is, and not just as a design concept, but how it might help us to start to change the dialogue about transportation planning, about how we build streets, and about how we build transportation in general. So what I'm going to do to start with is to give some background, because one of the things that I've learned at CNU, and one of the things that I did not learn at engineering school, is that the history is important. We need to understand where things come from if we're going to make changes. In engineering school, I was taught that the engineering method that we use started in 1970. There was nothing before that. But we need to understand this history, to understand where ideas like shared space fit into the scheme of things, to the arch of the changes that we're trying to achieve. So I'm using some pictures here to illustrate shared space, and I've selected a picture from the center of Amsterdam, which is probably not on anybody's tour of shared spaces. But I just wanted to illustrate the fact that this concept that seems so new is what has been used to build some of our best cities. This is how streets are built in Amsterdam. And this is another example from the William Park neighborhood in Amsterdam, built around 1920s. So this is the start of the story that I want to tell. 1908, the Model T, the Ford Model T assembly line. This is basically the start of many of the problems that we're talking about in terms of transportation and transportation effect on cities. I like to show, in almost any presentation I do, to show this graph because I think this is really a roadmap of where we have been and to some extent where we are going. This incredible run-up in driving in America is really what we're talking about here, and it is the problem that we need to confront. But as you can see, we keep talking about hope. There is hope in this graph. You can see the decrease in traveling since 2004. In the transportation field, we like to talk about cause and effect. And there's a lot of debate going on now about what is the cause of this. We like to talk about this as if nothing that we do matters, that policy doesn't matter, that things just happen by happenstance. That change, that decrease in travel is basically due to a lot of the things that you have heard about here, the back advocates, a lot of the changes in how we think about streets, etc. In fact, I would say that it went back, the changes goes back to 1992 with the highway bill called Ashta, which started a conversation about other types of transportation besides highway. Before that, the federal highway bill was always about building more and more highways. In 1992, this changed, and I think that was the start of a change in conversation. As part of the history, Peter Norton, who spoke 2 years ago at CNU, has helped us reclaim some of the history. He talks about some of what went into making this run-up possible. So it wasn't just that traffic increased. We also need to recognize that in order for traffic to have increased, we had to do things. We had to change our cities. We had to change how we build streets, etc. And what Norton has been able to show is the history of how this took place. And he writes that in this book that before the automobile, that the users of the streets were diverse, that they included children at play and pedestrians at large. By 1930, so oftentimes we think about the change in how cities were built as going back to 1950s, but the groundwork was laid long before that. By 1930s, most streets were primarily for automobile travel. And this did not occur by accident. What he points out is that there was a campaign, there was an active campaign to change people's attitude. So anybody that used the street wrongly was labeled as a jaywalker. And one of the things that he points out is that this was a term of mockery. And they were very powerful in using mockery to change the language, to change the conversation. He also points out that, so we had this physical change, and he went on to say that this was not an evolution. It was a bloody and sometimes violent revolution. And I think what we need is another revolution. We need to change. We need, once again, to instill the idea that streets are for people, for the economic well-being of cities, and not just for moving things. This is not just a US issue. I found this slide, this figure, when I was living in Zurich 2 years ago. This is from a planning textbook in Zurich, and they talk about the type of behavior, the very Germanic way: false, right, correct, false. These people running around looking crazy in the streets, that was false. We had to stop that. We should stay in the sidewalks if we wanted to avoid accidents. For those of you that don't speak German, like me, this is what the translation says. This is from Traffic Education for School Children, and it says this was a definition of the street. So this was in Zurich, Switzerland. This is a place that we often look for good ideas about design. They were forcing pedestrians to behave. What I find interesting about this sketch, I was really taken by this sketch, is that Ben uses almost exactly the opposite paradigm to talk about the change back that we need. So this is the sketch that you'll see in Ben's presentation. This is what we need to change from. And I'm going to use the German paradigm. and label it, this is wrong, and this is what we need to go towards. Okay, so quickly, what we have been trapped in is what I refer to as the Ashta Era. This started around 1930s when they started to codify how we should build roads. And over time, the functional classification that John so loves to hate came about around 1970. It's really hard to believe that is something that just came out of whole cloth so late, but has been so influential on how we build cities. So this is the book that most cities use for building transportation, for building streets. After Ice-T, the federal government, so that was the start of this unraveling. 1992 Ice-T, 1997, there was a meeting in Maryland of the Maryland DOT called Looking Beyond the Pavement. And the idea here was that engineers had been focused on this, that their only thing was to consider what was going on within the right-of-way of the road. And this conference was the idea that we needed as engineers to look beyond the pavement, because there were things beyond the pavement that mattered. And out of that came this FAWA report that talks about flexibility in highway. All of a sudden, the idea was we could build better roads by being more flexible with the standards in Ashta. In the mid-noughts, ITE and CNU got together with funding from EPA and from the FHWA, thank you, Lynn, and we got funding to work on this document, and this was a really important change. Looking back at it, I see it as a really, it's been very influential in a lot of ways, and it has led to a slew of design manuals from different places. It's a parallel movement is a Complete Streets movement, which has worked in parallel with the IT CNU document to start to unravel the Ashta Era. And now we're seeing, I ran into David a few months ago in a train, and I forced him to pose for this picture. This is one of the many documents that is coming out that is starting to question the assumptions in Ashta. So there's a whole slew of them in different cities. But what I would say is that all of these documents still reference back to how we do things in Ashta. So they're better than what we had before, but they're still the same way of looking at roads. So some of the criticisms you see in Victor Dover and John Massengale's excellent book about street design is because of that problem. We still cannot build streets and streets that support places fully. We end up with these hybrids that are not that are somewhat safer, but certainly often very ugly. And a large part of that is because of this, the fact that we're still in this Ashta mindset. So the mindset change that we need, I learned when I went to Drachten in the Netherlands to look at shared space design there. And surprisingly, when I got there, I wasn't taken out to see the streets. The engineer sat us down and gave us a lecture about this idea of system time. And basically, what I came away from is understanding that this is what we have been operating in. We have been trying to use this approach, the approach of single-purpose regulated spaces to build roads, when in fact, The shared space approach was this context time approach, which is very, very much tied to how we think about design as new urbanists. So what is interesting for me is that we have had this parallel track going on. We have had these folks in UK and in the Netherlands developing this approach to design that is not new urbanist in title, but is basically our soul brothers. So this is where I think we really need to be going, is this idea that streets are in cities, most streets in cities are social places that need a different approach to design. And that's what shared space is about. It's about control, understanding that speed matters. This is something I learned from CNU also, and I didn't learn in engineering school. I learned from Rick Hall that speed matters, and basically everything about design when we're dealing with traffic is about controlling the speed. So, I would like to welcome Ben, and I'm looking forward to his presentation. The last time I saw him speak was in London. We had a transportation summit. It was a wonderful summit, but we were in a rickety town hall in Shoreditch. Horrible acoustics. I couldn't hear a word you said. And so I'm really glad to get the opportunity to hear your message again. So welcome.
Gosh, thank you. Well, really, Norman has said everything that I was going to say, so I can sit down again. But if I may take a little more of your time this morning, just to maybe bring you up to date with some of the progress that I hope we've been slowly making in Europe, and particularly recently in the UK, in ways that might be useful for you in your cities, here in Buffalo or anywhere else. So I'm not going to talk specifically about Buffalo, merely to say how remarkable and how grateful I am to everyone who organized that trip last night to Silo City. For people like myself, I've never seen this before. It was astonishing. I think the word here that you use is awesome. Is that right? Awesome, which in English is really rather good. Clearly, a lot of work went into to this. I have no idea what this poster means, but I like it very much. But I hope that there are a few thoughts about streets. Now, clearly, as Norman has said, I'm not going to repeat, but the history of streets, they're a hugely important role as the principal public space of cities, the place of display and encounter and movement. And I just love old pictures. Isn't this a beautiful picture of New York? Everything about both the transport function and the display function of cities. It's important because transportation, of course, isn't an end in itself. It's a means to an end. The purpose of streets and the purpose of cities is merely threefold. It's economic exchange, social exchange, and cultural expression. Is that clear? Money, sex, and art, basically. It's important. But, and of course, streets, as I'm sure we all know, define so much of how we think about and remember cities. They are the principal front and gateways, what we recall. And they needn't necessarily be grand avenues like the Champs-Élysées. Some streets, very boring ones, remain eternal, particularly for my generation, who grew up taking much of the language of the street for granted. If you remove the four old deers in the foreground, much of the language is the same: curbs separating the pedestrian area from the carriageway, as we call it, parallel parking along one side, and defined places to cross the road where the Fab Four are dutifully doing. But I love history, and many of you may have seen this one of the earliest clip that survives of a street. This is San Francisco's Market Street in 1906. Shared space is nothing new. I love the choreography of this. I find this very moving. But isn't that a mean policeman? Goodness me, wouldn't mess with him. but the whole interaction of different activities of human life in every essence, of course, destroyed tragically 2 days after that film was taken by the earthquake and fire. We have a legacy that goes back to the beginning of the last century, Corbusier and many others from the CIAM in Europe, trying to rethink streets. It's easy for us now to disparage the notion that Corbusier and colleagues have that cities really shouldn't have streets at all. They should be much more rational, organized, separated. But here was a Europe coming out of the chaos and terror of the First World War, and the rational ordering, a simple ordering of life somehow was a dream that was utterly understandable. It's reflected in much of the art of the 19th century, of the 20th century, Mondrian's work of order and clarity and so on was a tremendous dream that our earlier generations had. And of course, in Britain, as I'm sure you're aware, the notion of separating traffic from other aspects of life, of segregation, as it was called at the time, it was embodied in the very influential and very eloquent and articulate report for the British government, Traffic in Towns, 1963. This vision of the pedestrian precinct, of keeping traffic separate, and of maybe layering cities. This sketch for Tottenham Court Road, it wasn't built, fortunately, but I suspect you can find in almost every city you know traces of this notion of keeping pedestrians away from traffic. You don't have to walk very far from this building to find that notion. And of course, it was a principle enthusiastically adopted by politicians. This is the first line of the resulting policy document in the UK in 1966, traffic segregation as the core principle. And of course, all that redefined our notion of what public space was. Where were the boundaries for children? This was an extract from a poster sent to every UK school by the British government in my lifetime when I was at school. A very clear redefinition of what space was and where children should play, maybe become more imaginative in looking for places to play. But it was really the publication of a safety program in 1981 by the UK Department for Transport, which got me really interested in this subject. And it was this poster, very hard-hitting poster, stressing the nature of the curb as a boundary between two quite distinct and separate worlds. And the penalty, of course, for transgressing that boundary, pretty severe. I mean, in Britain, I know over here you put people to death for making mistakes, but in UK it's not such a common occurrence. But it's a striking image somehow. And of course, in its own right, very successful in that its aim was to reduce child pedestrian figures. And it did that most successfully, of course, by reducing child pedestrians. Not surprisingly, every parent then chose to drive their children to school and elsewhere. And of course, across Europe as well as here, we have a broadly segregated streetscape in different forms. This is a typical UK town. The public realm ends at the curb, maybe with a barrier. The space in the middle belongs to something else. It's part of a highway. It'll be the same whether you're in Inverness or Dover. You might be lucky and be able to press a button and apply for permission to cross, but you're not in the public realm. It's the same thing here, that you have to land of the free and all of that stuff, land of the live free or die, is it? But don't forget to apply for permission to cross the road. So, of course, as Norman points out, we have over the years overlaid our spaces and junctions with a whole lot of individual measures, no doubt put in place for seemingly very good reasons, but making no place at all. And if this is an unkind cartoon, I remind myself sometimes that this is the approach to part of London, off Kew Bridge, full of really expensive bits of kit put in place and maintained at huge public expense on the assumption that it's necessary in order to resolve all the complex movement that space requires. And even here, we spend a fortune on poles and lamps and lights and so on. Lots of public money goes into it. Sometimes it's puzzling. I come across towns which spend, I think, Guildford in Britain, I think they may be expecting a escape of bears from the local zoo or something, I don't know, but it still goes on. But in more recent years, of course, a pressure, the realization of the importance of pedestrian movement and numbers has begun to really put pressure on a rethink about the nature of segregation. So to misquote the Beatles, the notion that we might do it in the road. Now, the interesting thing of discovering the late Hans Monderman, one of the many pioneers of this, not the only one, but certainly an extraordinary thinker, a traffic engineer, you can tell by his tie, but he first, when I met him, talked about safety. He was the head of road safety, and he said, if you want to avoid killing or injuring people on the roads, your street must tell the right story. It must reflect the aspirations, the past and the future of a place. And I thought for a traffic engineer, that really wasn't bad. And he then drew for me, on the same day I met him, on a napkin, a point that Norman has already made, that we need, our economic structures need both highways and public space. They're both important. It's wrong to assume that highways aren't necessary, that whilst the automobile is such an important part of our lives and our economies, we need highways. And for them to work well, they require certain characteristics. They're heavily regulated. They're controlled by the state. We pass exams to use them. We accept the strictures of the police and so on. We expect them to be continuous, predictable. We don't use them for any other purpose. We don't trade or socialize on them. And we expect a very simple language of signs and marking. But everything about successful public space has exactly the opposite characteristics. It's rarely successful if regulated by the state. It tends to be unpredictable, changing, flexible, and we use a much more complex gamut of human communication skills in order to negotiate that world. So whilst we will have these sorts of facilities until John gets round to knocking a few more down, we have these places, and of course they're governed by AASHTO guidelines, or in Britain a whole raft of traffic manuals. I don't recommend you read these things unless you're seriously insomniac, but they are important, and traffic engineers call them the Bible, and we don't mess with religion necessarily. But my observation is that the worst urban spaces come when these two important worlds clash, and we're confused about which is which. We don't know whether this is public space or highway, so it works badly from both counts. It's both congested and unsafe. Here in Buffalo, there's some confusion about whether this is highway or not. Incidentally, you have to be a speed reader around here very clearly. But it's not just here. I mean, Toronto, a city that I'm most impressed by, wonderful work by Jennifer and colleagues, but I mean, some of this waterfront, is this highway or is it public space? It's not clear. Now, what Hans Monderman also said is that if you want safety in streets, never treat drivers as idiots, because they act as idiots. Treat drivers as intelligent beings, and you get an intelligent response. We've known this from educational psychology for many years, and it's beginning to apply. So in other words, don't let the state think on behalf of the driver. It doesn't make for safety. We spend a lot of money trying to explain stuff. This is my hometown, Bristol. I have no idea what it means either. But we just here around the corner, we've got instructions how to use these things. Nobody takes any notice, of course. In Toronto, hugely long, you have to stand and read this for hours to understand how to cross the road. But of course, we've all known for a long time that signs are a useless way to communicate behavior. They really don't influence us particularly. But they're also very powerful ways to communicate values. And the way that cities present their streets send signals and values very clearly. This is Torbay. I'm sorry, I couldn't resist it. But here, as you come into Buffalo, so handsome buildings and so on, but somehow it isn't the buildings that immediately affect the foreground of our vision. It's a whole series of small-scale incidental measures which accumulate to give a notion that public space doesn't really matter very much. And as we know, it does. It does for all sorts of economic and social reasons. Now, we are in a fortunate position, as often been said, as we're understanding much more about human psychology and behavioral psychology of the past 10, 20 years, some tremendous work on understanding who we are as complex creatures. And I often use the analogy of the ice rink to illustrate how complex. You would never believe, if you took an ice rink as a theoretical model, that it would be possible for complete strangers to strap steel blades to their boots and slide around on ice. But we know that part of the pleasure of using an ice rink is that we engage in this remarkable process of coordination and anticipation, which is part of the joy of this process, and we know where beginners go and where experts go and what happens when somebody falls over and so on. Humans are remarkably adaptable in moving. If you recall, sometimes flocks of birds or shoals of fish. And of course, in the absence of highway controls and mechanisms, it isn't as if we don't know how to behave. This is a campsite I take my children to sometimes, and there's quite a lot of cars. It's as big as a small town sometimes. But in the absence of any speed limits or spaces to cross, it isn't as if we don't know how to behave. On the contrary, the social protocols take over much more strongly than do the signs and so on. Now, the other aspect of shared space, which is difficult because it's counterintuitive, but it's essential to understand, is a changing view of the nature of risk and its importance to public space. It's a changing view about safety and what it means. Safety is a very complex subject, but people like Professor John Adams, formerly of Canada, but now living in London, has been researching and writing the complex, counterintuitive nature of hazards and risk. And his book on what's called risk compensation theory, I do recommend to you. But you see his influence on the British government, CABE, that's the design advisory body, publishing documents such as the value of risk in public space, arguing that it isn't not having hazards present which keeps us safe. Those hazards keep us aware of our environment and allow us to adapt our behavior to an appropriate form of safety. And I want to illustrate with just one example of John Adams' many aspects he picks out about how counterintuitive safety is, and it's important. There is in Jerusalem, I don't need to go into detail, but there's an area called the Bnei Brak, a particular group of Jewish immigrants, largely from Eastern Europe, who are very ultra-Orthodox, and for whatever reason, it doesn't matter, they're the world's worst pedestrians. They never cross at the lights, they never hold their children's hands, they never look left and right, they just kind of walk into traffic. And they've been studied by lots of sociologists and so on for many years. What was interesting was that Adams noticed that the next door neighborhood, roughly the same density of population, the same volume of traffic, were largely made up of secular Jews, predominantly from Central Europe and Germany, who of course are culturally very obedient. If you've ever been to Germany, they stand to attention with 3 o'clock in the morning waiting for the pedestrian lights to change. But what was interesting was to discover that which of those two areas had the highest pedestrian casualty rates. You've got it, it's the secular area. Why? Because drivers aren't stupid. And the drivers in Jerusalem had adapted their behavior to drive through the Bnei Brak because these guys are crazy walking to the road. So jaywalking makes streets safer. So I do urge you, please, to try and jaywalk and encourage others to do so at all times. When I last spoke in Pasadena, I made this point and walked out of the conference hall and was instantly ticketed for jaywalking by a cop. But just briefly, this notion of risk and safety is important. It's changing very fast in Europe, and I think it's a little bit behind yet still in North America. But safety is important. I don't want to depress you too much, but this is a playground in North London. You can see it's been safety audited recently. It's had rubberized matting put in, some barriers put in, no swings, of course, because no children. And when asked why, this is what I was told. Well, the kids might come in and hurt themselves. Failing to understand that the reason children are evolved to play is to test their risk boundaries, that's what they're doing, which by definition means accidents. Most accidents are good things. And that's a difficult concept to understand, but we may come back to that. But it does mean that an approach to street design based on awareness and learning and understanding the realities of driving half a ton of metal around seems to be a more sensible approach to safety than segregating that traffic off. Now, as Norman mentioned, speed, of course, is so critical that the notion of speed is central to our work on shared space. Speed is very rarely discussed in the context of what speed would be like traffic to be moving around cities. Almost everybody talks about speed limits. Now, speed limits are a quite different thing. They're a means to an end. And I would urge you always to ask the fundamental question, what speed would be ideal to have traffic moving? 1 mile an hour may be too slow, 100 miles an hour too quick. But it's interesting to note that there appears to be a kink in the graph of our relationship to the disbenefits of speed based around our human evolved speed. We are designed to withstand impacts of about 18, 19, 20, 21 miles an hour. It's a speed that a fit young hunter would be running chasing the antelope. I couldn't run that fast, but a modern Olympic runner runs at about that speed. And there appears, therefore, to be a relationship between a speed and our evolved physiology. And it's important because it hugely affects the accessibility and the sort of people who can use public space, children, elderly people, people with blind or visual impairments and so forth. Now, the late Hans Monderman, I'm sure many of you have heard of him. I want to touch just briefly on some of his work because he enormously influenced me and other people. His work in his native Friesland began to explore what was possible if you simply removed many of the conventional traffic engineering principles. He removed the traffic lights here on a junction in Drachten and discovered that not only did the safety record improve, but that the capacity of that junction to serve traffic improved. But it's all premised on much lower speeds, of course. And he began to explore a language of engineering, tying traffic engineering in with an understanding of place to understand the nature of context, of edge friction, of new concepts in engineering, to give him the design speed that would make his places work. He took me to this center of the town of Oosterwolde on the first day I met him, a small market town. There were previously traffic signals here with long queues and congestion. And what he created there was a simple big red square, and the traffic flows across it as before. And I was impressed to hear him say, I can't do his accent really, but have you ever seen so many traffic violations in one place? It's wonderful. That's why it works. There's no God. You have to look after yourself. And it's not unusual to see people standing around in that space. It doesn't seem to make any difference to the performance in engineering terms. I think the local authority employed this old boy to walk back and forth to keep it safe. But Hans's work did begin to spawn a different language of what streets could be, a language of influences in Britain, in Brighton's New Road, one of many new streets, which still allow traffic to move through and serve the theatres and so on, but in a very different relationship between the two. This issue, I'll just come back once more to this issue of risk and safety, to illustrate it through one of the last projects that Hans Monderman and his team did. A common problem of the primary school of a small town, Noordlaren, being on the edge of a busy road and parents and teachers being fussed about the speed of traffic going past that playground. It's a very common problem. The usual solution is to build a bigger fence or wall between the children playing and the street and to get the children in some other way. Now, Hans and his team did exactly the opposite. They took the wall down and extended the primary school playground across the main road. So you now drive into the town of Noordlaren through the primary school playground. All the benches that the parents wait for their children on all spill out into the street. There's hopscotch, chalk marks all over the street. No signs at all. But I tell you, it's extraordinary. You cannot drive past that school without being intimately connected with its activities, and speeds drop hugely. It's infinitesimally small numbers of people wish to kill children. It's very encouraging. But it's remarkable how the drivers, without any other rules or changes, not only adapt their speed here, but throughout the rest of the town of Noordlaren as well. Now, this notion of creating low-speed, continuous flow, vital streets, there's many precedents, particularly some of the ones I've stolen in Europe. Hennef near Bonn in Germany is one example of a very busy street carrying about 14,000 vehicles a day, which through its use of the median strip and these lighting canopies and lighting columns in the middle and the canopy of the trees has created the right sort of edge friction to give you the design speed. But I think the work I wanted to illustrate of another engineer, Fritz Kobi, from Bern in Switzerland, I think gives us some very encouraging hope. Bern is a radial city with lots of very busy roads carrying maybe 22 to 25,000 vehicles a day, really, really busy. And this is, I'm sorry to be such a boring traffic geek, but I strapped a camera to one of the lamp columns and just let it run. And what is created there through very careful attention to dimensional details, very cheap, just concrete and asphalt, but it's created it took out all the signals, all the pedestrian crossings, and created a speed framework exactly as his design speed intended, which allows pedestrians to simply flow across that line of traffic. And of course, the effect, the economic effect on the edges of this street was quite remarkable. And to his own astonishment, he discovered that the capacity of the road went up. More traffic got through, journey times dropped, but of course, these radial routes no longer became the social and economic barriers that they were before. For any traffic geeks like me, I can play more of this, but it does illustrate, I think, what is possible, even on really busy roads. This is not a quiet place. But the idea of using placemaking to overcome the barrier effects, most cities in the world have some major highway, for this case in Aachen in Germany, a 5-lane highway separating the station in the bottom right from the town centre top left. And just this simple insertion of a brushed concrete ellipse is enough not only to make it very clear as you come out of the station where you go towards the city centre, but it alerts drivers who are not stupid to the relationship between station and town centre. So there are lots of squares and intersections beginning to emerge across mainland Europe and in the UK, which illustrate that it's possible to really create great places at intersections which don't have to be simply standardized traffic engineering. I mean, just outside of here, the relationship between this questionable architecture of the Congress Hall, but it's clearly the architect has tried hard to flow people out and surely could incorporate that intersection as well. There are many examples. Gossip Square, Skvallartorget in Norrköping in Sweden is one example of a square which handles about 11,500 vehicles a day without any traffic signals at all. I do urge you to take out all of the traffic signals in every city in the USA. I think it would be a very simple thing to do. Hans, of course, transformed one of the busiest junctions in the Weiplein, in his hometown of Drachten, into a place, and of course famously refused to refer to it as a roundabout. He wanted to call it a squareabout. Why? Because the emphasis was on the square, the plus, and the traffic infrastructure was merely a secondary aspect, not the primary one. And all of the lighting and all of the geometry and so on did that. The British government, the UK government, has produced it's file under dull but important. The Manual for Streets has for the first time formally recognised streets as places in their own right as well as corridors for movement. And this has allowed us to be much more bold in our approach and working with engineers. Exhibition Road in West London is probably the most well-known example that's emerged in recent years, a great street that serves all the museums and cultural institutions of West London. Formerly, it really wasn't a very attractive street in its own right. It didn't really do justice to the great buildings around it. The huge numbers of school children coming to visit had to be sort of caroled onto the sidewalks by patient teachers, and it wasn't really a very pleasant place to walk up and down, and nor was it a very pleasant place to drive up and down either, because it was always congested. So we managed to work with the London Borough of Kensington and Chelsea on ways in which we create a new type of street, a linear public space, which could still accommodate the 9,000 or so vehicles that move along there daily, but begin to reflect the actual way pedestrians like to move across a street. Pedestrians are, as you all know, great Pythagoreans. We love taking the hypotenuse. We cross streets diagonally, and it therefore makes sense to allow and encourage that to happen. And it's encouraging to see with the design of Exhibition Road now complete, a very different feel beginning to emerge. It was just interesting that when we were doing this, the Department for Transport in Britain were very fussed about how we would sign this street. What sort of street was it? What sort of signing would we put on? The Times journalist produced a cartoon, which I love very dearly, suggesting a new type of sign. Just to a couple of last examples, Ashford is a small town in Kent. It's where the Channel Tunnel comes up, and probably in anticipation of the danger of the damn French coming in with their garlic and so on, they decided to build a barrier around the town in the form of a very difficult to cross 3-lane one-way racetrack. It was very successful. The French didn't get anywhere near Ashford, but unfortunately the market town of Ashford started to die. It wasn't really very pleasant to come in through the urine-soaked underpasses, and why would you want to go into Ashford? So we worked to try and keep the traffic, but put it back to two-way, of course, that's pretty obvious, but to create a different sort of language of streets which could allow that traffic still to flow, but allow it to be part of the identity and town centre of Ashford. We plonked odd things like the odd rusty nut. I have no idea what it means either, but it's nice. It just sits there in the middle of what is sometimes used as a roundabout, sometimes not. But what we discovered is it is possible to create a different relationship between pedestrians and drivers, even on really pretty busy roads. So I want to leave you with a scheme in a place called Poynton. Now, Poynton's a very boring little town. I hope they won't mind me saying that, but 17,000 people. It's a crossroads town between Macclesfield and Stockport, just south of Manchester. And for years, the volume of traffic going through this town built up to about 26,000 vehicles a day, at 2,500 an hour, with very high content of trucks, HGVs. And over the years, the attempt to resolve this, traffic signals, additional lanes have been put in, more and more lanes. There's a beautiful Alfred Waterhouse church, a lich gate opened straight onto the traffic signals. And this centre of town really wasn't an attractive place in its own right. And of course, towns will only survive nowadays if they are attractive in their own right. There's no other reason. So when we arrived, over 16 of the 32 businesses in the shop were boarded up and closed down, and it looked pretty sad. We produced a master plan for it, which involved taking out every trace of highway engineering from the middle of that town. We were a bit nervous because no one had done this on this volume before, but crucially, returning the high street to a much slower speed environment, but crucially changing the main junction in the middle of Poynton to a sort of informal double roundel. It's not a roundabout, it's a roundel. But it would only work if we could reduce the approach speeds to between 16 and 17 miles an hour. And we did that through dramatically, visually narrowing the approaches. The biggest truck on the roads can still get in perfectly all right, so can the fire engines. But the feel is of a much narrower space and lots of edge friction, vertical elements in the eyes of the driver to make life interesting, encourage as many beautiful people to be wandering around because the brain likes to absorb that information. And of course, by controversially reducing it from 3 lanes to 1, we managed to make the junction more efficient. Most people thought we were mad. It was already congested with 3 lanes a mile back. Surely with 1, the traffic would be all the way up to Manchester. Well, we reduced it to 1 approach lane in each direction. Of course, it gave us huge volumes of space for parking and whatever else, much wider footways. And as it opened, people were amazed to discover that within 10 minutes of it reopening, there were no more queues, that the capacity of the junction had changed. We used these courtesy crossings diagonally spaced across the road to reflect the common patterns of pedestrian movement, and they in turn simply allow pedestrians to wander across the road wherever we are. But it's really in the centre of Poynton, this very bleak former place. It's not uncommon, many towns have this problem, that we've tried to create a very strong sense of place in order to influence driver movement. And it's very pleasing to me, a year in or so, to begin to see traffic moving through Poynton, the same volumes as before, but much, much better journey times and about a 4-5-fold increase in pedestrian presence in the small town. We've now got none of the businesses are let. There's a waiting list for Poynton. But it depended. There's an interesting debate about speed here. A lot of people thought we were crazy because I suggested not reducing the speed limit from 30 to 20. And I wasn't prepared to die in a ditch over it, but I'm now very glad we didn't, because reducing a 20 or lowering the speed limit would have still assumed, in giving expectations to the driver, that that's the speed I should be going. And of course it isn't. It varies according to who's in front of you, what you're around, what the time of day, are the school children coming out, and so on. That all changes. But what's remarkable about Poynton is this extraordinary transformation in the relationship between drivers and pedestrians and cyclists and drivers and drivers. And as somebody says on the small film that's on YouTube, Poynton Regenerated, it's just we're kind of being nicer to each other suddenly. Everyone in town is being nicer to each other. And I think that that's an interesting reflection of what started out as an economic regeneration scheme, but solved through traffic problems. For traffic geeks like me, I love watching it speed up because you realize how extraordinarily intelligent drivers are if left to their own devices. But the town of Poynton itself has sprung back to life. It's now voted the 7th most popular place to live in Britain. but the dwell times and the quality of space does seem to have improved because we've won so much more of it, and we've been able to create space outside the magnificent Waterhouse lich gate so that a bride or a hearse can pull out outside the lich gate with some dignity and not under the wheels of an HGV at a traffic signal. So, I mean, if these use of design, I hope will be useful. If you are interested, there is this short 15-minute YouTube video which explains the project in a bit more detail. But crossings like this, learning how every centimetre of crossing counts, keeping them as narrow as they possibly can be, trying to avoid these long treks across the wide lanes. You've got much, much less traffic here in Buffalo than, I tell you what, in most British towns. But I want to leave you with a space which has been in place a long time. It's my favourite shared space, I think, in the world, and I'm proud to say it's in London. It's in a place called Seven Dials. Many of you will know it. As its name suggests, it's a space that 7 streets converge, and in 1987 they re-erected the Sundial Monument in the middle. Very nice thing. It's a little podium. There's always very, very good-looking women sitting, showing off their nice clothes and fashion in the middle. It's a great place to be seen and to watch people. And it's, of course, covers with tourists and office workers, but it's also very busy for traffic. And remarkably, we now have 20 years or more statistics on this. It turns out to be both the safest and the least congested junction of its type in Camden. And I think I'll leave you with just a feel for what the feel of Seven Dials is, because it illustrates something broader about shared space. It's no longer just about design of streets and capacity and movement, but about a quality which we rarely refer to of civility, of how we generate the natural civility upon which cities depend. You'll see that the pedestrians don't take a lot of notice of the traffic, but the drivers are sitting slightly further forward in their seats. They're very, very conscious and aware and anticipating the individual circumstances of those people with whom they're engaging. Are any of you old enough here to remember Fawlty Towers? Remember? Yeah, do you remember the Major in Fawlty Towers? Morning, Major. The old boy, he's still going, but sometimes he has the odd senior moment, as we all do, and he completely forgets what he came out for in the first place. But it doesn't matter, because the expectation of the taxi driver is, well, that's fine. So it seems to me that there's still this principle of creating civility in our cities, moving from an environment which looks something like this, or indeed lost space at your intersections. You can reuse a lot of stuff. You can turn your traffic lights into useful Christmas decorations, the lovely Christmas lights. And the signs make very good tabletops in cafes and so on, to move back to a world in which we can rely on the natural civilities to which humans are blessed. So I leave it there. Thank you very much.
Well, we were hoping to have some time for questions, but I think we're up at the limit. So I just have one more thing to say. I am tired of going to Europe to look at these great schemes. I think Buffalo, Bilbao has the Guggenheim. Everybody go there for that. I think Buffalo could become the shared space place in North America. One question. Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay, I was told that we have time for one question, so... Yes, any takers?
at CNU, and so my question is that appointment was beautiful, except I didn't see any green. And how do you manage stormwater in your redesigned spaces?
So the question is, how do you manage stormwater? Poynton was all pavement. How do you manage stormwater in a situation like that?
It's a good question, and of course this is a huge subject about good street design, and I wish we had more time to answer your question more fully. Just to put you in the picture, we introduced new trees into Poynton, but more as a place-making device and a signal to drivers than as an ecological response. The place has to withstand such a huge loading from the heavy trucks that come through there that we were somewhat limited in ways that we're not in quieter streets. I briefly showed a scheme in Brighton's New Road, and there, because we brought the speeds down, we can then begin to introduce permeable paving, be much more flexible in the way in which you allow water to permeate surfaces, because you no longer have to assume that drivers are driving at 30, 40 miles an hour. I have a long fantasy, and I hope that someone will commission me to design a grass street from building edge to building edge, using reinforced grasses. The techniques are now with us. You probably need a European damp or a British damp climate to do it, but I like the idea of being able to manage it by where the parking bays are. You can scatter wildflowers so the surface is different colors, and you get a parking ticket if the grass is going yellow under your car. I like that.
Okay. Or was that you? Okay. Okay.
So, I guess you'll have to repeat.
Thank you. I wonder if there's any research with regard to people who are disabled in terms of visually impaired and stuff like that. Because the Fawlty Towers major aside, we probably exist in a more litigious environment here. And even in Canada, we're building a square that's more of a shared space in our downtown. And I was hauled into the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, who were very angry. And I'm sure they're not getting the concept, but to get ahead of that before it becomes a counterpoint, is there any research that we can draw upon in North America? Because I think there could be a serious backlash.
There is, and again, that's a very big subject, so forgive the somewhat curt response. Creating these streets is not easy. Please don't assume that for your politicians, you're going in for a rough ride. You're going to need very clear, determined politicians to create streets like this. Because much of it is counterintuitive. You are, in the words of my mentor, creating safe streets by making them more dangerous. And that's quite a difficult concept to get your head around. Now, in Poynton, as in every other scheme, we had terrific opposition from all sorts of special interest groups. The cyclists, the truck drivers, the taxis were against it, the traders were against it. And the blind and partially sighted groups, who are very politically very powerful in Britain, were really against it. What we did was to work with individual people who we knew on the register we could work with and spend time with them and gradually allow them to adapt and refine the design until they were comfortable with it. But at the end of the day, the issue is about speed. Because overall, if you can bring traffic speeds down, then you simply create the relationship between drivers and traffic that allows the major to have that relationship with the taxi driver. And of course, if you're disabled or blind or confused or a child, that is the single principal determinant of safety. So bring your design speeds down. Forget speed limits. I would advise abolishing all speed limits in cities. In the same way that it's not illegal to fart in church, but no one does it, Yeah. Social protocols are more powerful than regulatory ones.
Let me just add an additional point to that. In the US, there's been a long debate about visually impaired people at roundabouts. And so there's a lot of research on that issue that might help in this debate when it comes to shared space, because I think there are some similar issues, not quite the same issues. Okay.
Thank you for a fabulous talk, Pam. We've been trying to get you back for years. I'm so glad we succeeded. I'm wondering about the novelty effect. As shared spaces become more predominant, will people, pedestrians, drivers, start to drop their guard a bit? I mean, as it becomes more routinized and sort of standardized. And will there be another revolution, just like there was from shared streets to auto streets back? if it's too far too fast, will there be a big backlash and a revolution back towards previous conditions?
Yeah, well, as the yogi said, you know, it's always hard making predictions, especially about the future. But so far, one of the things that from the observations and research so far is that a couple of things have surprised us. First of all, the behavioral changes that a well-designed scheme brings about appear to be permanent. They don't change. So schemes like Seven Dials, which has been in place for 25 years now, or Skvallertorget in the Netherlands, in Sweden, been in place for 12, 13 years, doesn't seem to change speeds or driver behavior. Neither does it change between strangers and local people who are familiar with it, which is a lot of people are concerned about that. So I'm pretty confident that we are now, 10 years ago, as Norman said, this was considered a pretty zany idea. It's now mainstream. It's written into policy documents in Britain. So I think that there's always a backlash, and don't expect to go into these schemes without a lot of artillery fire, because it's quite tough. But I think they're permanent. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ben. This has been amazing. Okay. So, one housekeeping announcement. The 2 o'clock placemaking session is Melbourne, past, present, and future. It's misprinted in the program, so that's the correction. So thank you very much for your attention. And we have a transportation initiative luncheon, so any of you that are interested to continue with this issue,